What's up, everybody? This is the Booch, and welcome to episode 6 of the Boochcast reviews Darkside of the Ring. I'm excited to be back. We've got a great episode for you guys this week. This is going to be one that's on the bit of a controversial nature, and certain things are going to be talked about, certain things are going to be said. It's going to be an interesting episode. That's all I'm going to let you know, because this week we are diving into the story of the fabulous Moolah. Now, basically, this documentary talks about a lot of things, but the overall consensus is you can't talk about women's wrestling and not mention the fabulous Moolah. Because if she didn't run the women's wrestling business, there would be no women's wrestling. And that's just a fact. Fabulous Moolah is the foundation for women's wrestling. She is. If you are a woman in the wrestling business today, in the past, or in the future, and you achieve any success in this business, you owe a debt of gratitude to the fabulous Moolah. She is the reason women's wrestling even has a platform. I'm talking about actual women's wrestling, not the bra and panties matches or the paddle spankings or the seductive stuff the women did in the business during the Attitude Era, which I enjoy. And I know a lot of fans found it degrading. I found it entertaining because I'm a guy. So naturally I enjoyed those aspects of it. But as far as the wrestling goes, the fabulous Moolah was a big part of that. Because she was a wrestler, but also a promoter for the women. And as a promoter, she wanted to make money for her talent, and she also wanted to make money for Moolah, which sums up any fucking wrestling promoter you ever meet in your life has that mentality. They want to make money for the talent, and they want to make money for themselves. Now, apparently she was jealous of anyone who was younger than her in wrestling. People also said she was a manipulator, and she was a thief. And that in her promotion, there was sex, drugs, and a lot of abuse. Now, as to whether or not these accusations are true, I honestly don't know. All I'm going to talk about is what I saw in the documentary and give my personal thoughts. Now, one of the people we talked to is Selena Majors. She is a pro wrestler that went under the name Bambi. So if you remember Bambi from back in the day, that was her. And she defends Moolah throughout this documentary. Basically, they waited till she was dead to say these things, so she couldn't stand up and defend herself. And that, to me, is the big deal that I have. When the person's not around to defend themselves, it's easy to talk shit. And, unfortunately, we live in a world today where all you have to do is accuse somebody of a crime, and that's enough to condemn them. And I've always felt that's fucking bullshit. If you don't have evidence to back up a claim, you could throw the speculation around all you want. But no one should be condemned. Nobody should have their lives or careers ruined, alive or dead. And no decision should be made to affect that person's life, alive or dead, unless you have solid proof. If you don't have it, then it's all just hearsay. But unfortunately, we don't live in a world that revolves around logic and due process. We live in a world that involves, my little feelings are hurt, so I want this to go away so I can feel a little bit better and pretend that I did something right for society, when really I'm just a whiny snowflake with no logic and brain. That's pretty much fucking it. But anyway, at the end of the day, she gave tons of women opportunities. She was a great wrestler, but didn't know when to stop. You know who else was a great other people were great wrestler and didn't know when to stop? Fucking almost all of them. Ric Flair wrestled for way longer than he should have. Hulk Hogan, love him, wrestled way longer than he should have. We got legends that are still in the business today that are going longer than they should have in the eyes of other people. But the fact is, I look at it like this. Because these legends have the mastery of psychology, they're able to keep working even when they can barely walk, because they know how to get emotion from the crowd. Something that modern wrestlers today, most of them are incapable of pulling that off. That's why when they can't physically go anymore, they have to go out to pasture. Because the day they can no longer flip is the day they outlive their usefulness. Now, Mary Austin, who is the Fabulous Moolah's daughter, apparently Moolah made all of her costumes herself. She was a great heel who knew how to get her heat. The meaner she was, the more they liked it. So Fabulous Moolah obviously took great pride in being a heel wrestler. And again, she was very good at it. She just take a little spoon handle, roll it up with tape, and put it down in her bra. And then when she would pull it out when the ref was distracted and stick it in someone's eyes or stick it in her throat to like take cheap shots. You know, and there's like a home video of her telling that story, which I thought was cool. So she started off as a wrestler, and she later became the NWA Women's Champion, and she held that title for 28 years, which in modern wrestling today, that's a big fucking deal. Like, that is insane. Imagine anybody in wrestling today holding a title for 28 years. That would never happen today. At most, the longest someone goes with holding a title is a year and some change. But there were times where guys held wrestler belts for like 8 years, 4 years, 6 years. You know, like Bruno was an 8-year world champion. Bob Backlund had it for 6. Hulk Hogan held it for 4. You know, that was a long-ass title reigns. None of them held it for 28 years. Moolah did. That should tell you something. You know, she was a prominent title holder in what was technically a man's world back then. So she is a pioneer for women. So, and then later she became the booker of all the girls wrestlers. She was the one that, because again, she had the connections. She knew the promoters. She had the connections. She was able to, you know, help women find work over here, get booked, get paid, you know, and make a living. Also, the Fabulous Moolah also pioneered the hair-pulling, cat-fighting, scratching, crowd-pleasing kind of women's wrestling. Like, she broke multiple glass ceilings in the business. So that's why a lot of times in wrestling, you see hair pulling or the cat fighting or the scratching and just like rolling around doing all the, you know, the basic women fighting, you know, and it's great because back then that shit was believable. Because most of the time when you see a girl fight, you very rarely see women punching and kicking each other. They're usually grappling, pulling hair, and all that other shit. That's usually what you see. And then eventually, you know, she got into wrestling, you know, when there was no women's wrestling. And it was actually banned in Madison Square Garden. Like, when she got into the business, there was, like, Madison Square Garden banned women's wrestling. And Moolah was chosen to break the ban. Like, she was the featured girl in the first women's match in the Garden. She wrestled in Madison Square Garden for the first time. Like, that's a major barrier back then for women to break. Like, the best way to see that today would be like when we saw Natalia and I think it was Lacey Evans, if I'm not mistaken, when they fought in Saudi Arabia. When they had a women's wrestling match in Saudi Arabia. That feeling that you saw with that type of history being raid, that's the equivalent to MSG back then. Was a big fucking deal. And she was almost 60 years old at the time this happened. And she was on MTV during the Rock and Wrestling Connection, which had Cyndi Lauper and Captain Lou Albano kind of bringing that together. And then, of course, you know, later, you know, having the Hulk Hogan, Roddy Piper, Mr. T, you know, a bunch of other stuff. And during the MTV special for the WWF, she competed in the Brawl to End It All, which they talk about a little bit later. But she started in the 50s and made it to MTV and got the biggest payoff she ever made in the business. So that Brawl to End It All was her biggest payoff out of all the years she'd been in the business. Now, she learned how to fight real early in life because after her mom died, she was raised by her dad and her brothers. So they taught her how to fight. She was a teenager when her daughter was born. And her inspiration for getting into the business was a women's wrestler named Mildred Burke. And she went to go see Billy Wolf, who was Mildred's husband, and managed the whole women's troupe, for good and bad, according to Jim Cornette. So apparently Billy Wolf was, he did some good things as a manager, but he was also doing some bad things. And apparently when you became a wrestler for Billy Wolf, you automatically had to go to bed with him. Moolah rejected his advances and decided to train somewhere else. So she took that risk of walking away, saying, you know what? I'm not going to sleep with you to get a job. I'll figure it out. Now, Moolah at one point was married to another wrestler named Buddy Lee. Basically, they became a package deal. Like, she wrestled and he handled the booking. So Buddy Lee was the one that helped Moolah get booked everywhere before she became top woman. And they copied Mildred and Billy's model minus the sex part. They kept their own stable. They took all the bookings, and more importantly, a booking fee out of all the girls' pay. So she would take a fee, the girls would get paid, and she would take a commission. And you knew right off the bat why she got in the business and why she wanted to be a star. She loved money. And some people in the wrestling business consider that a bad thing. I don't. And I'll tell you why. Because I believe if you work hard, you deserve to get paid for it. But also, you find out very quickly, there is not a wrestler in the business that doesn't love the money and isn't about the money. Any wrestler that tells you they're not about the money is one of two things. They're either a liar or they're a mark. Fact of life. And Moolah plays such a dominant role in women's wrestling that in 2018, 11 years after her death, her memories still lewd over the sport. And WWE made the announcement on March 12th of that year that they were going to honor the Fabulous Moolah by having the Fabulous Moolah Memorial Battle Royal. Because before we had the men's Battle Royal with Andre the Giant. But for the women, they picked the Fabulous Moolah because out of all the women to honor in the business, that's the woman you want to honor. 2 or 3 days later, they took her name off the Battle Royal amid controversy. People started tweeting that Moolah had a history of abusing the women that worked for her, and she was pimping the girls out and feeding them drugs. And the woke, cancel culture piece of shit snowflakes contacted the sponsors, and they had to take her name off. And then we meet a gentleman by the name of Nigel Sherrod, who was the creator of the Fight for Moolah campaign. Now, Nigel is an indie wrestler in Georgia. And I've actually met Nigel Sherrod a few times. I've worked a couple indie shows with him. And he's also been to some UCW shows in the past. So I know Nigel. He's a pretty decent guy. And he started a petition to overturn the ruling. And he interviewed over 20 women who all denied these allegations. So everybody's paying attention to the women who claim this happened, but you got 20 women who are denying this happened. So if we're supposed to believe women, if we're supposed to believe all the women, why is nobody listening to their story? Why is their voice not being heard by the mainstream media and the wrestling observers? Is it because you're hypocritical? Could be. Now, the whole thing originated from an investigative newspaper story that quoted serious allegations by the family of South Carolina's first black female professional wrestler, Sweet Georgia Brown, who was one of the wrestlers who worked for Moolah. Now, according to Moolah's daughter, she trained her on a mattress in the living room. They didn't have much back then. And her son is a Baptist preacher. And according to her daughter, she was forced to do a lot of things against her will. Because also the daughter speaks in this as well. Sweet Georgia Brown's daughter was interviewed mostly. The son doesn't know for sure if they're true or not, but says if 1, 2, or 3 people are saying the same story, somebody ain't lying. If he truly believes that, he's a dumbass. I can tell you right now, if you get enough people to corroborate with a story, you can lie about anything. That's why numbers don't mean anything to me, because after a certain point, anybody can jump in and say something. And if you don't believe that so many people can lie about something, go back and watch the Bruiser Brody episode if you haven't already. You can find out how a group of people can get together and either in a conspiracy or out of fear make shit up. Now, for the better part of 25 years, every female wrestler in the business was trained by Moolah, booked by Moolah, and was controlled by Moolah's group. Now, back in the day, Moolah was protective of Sweet Georgia Brown because the KKK, which was, rampant back then, didn't like seeing a black woman in the ring. And in 1964, she was ranked number 4 in the world as a wrestler. She could have been a world champion, but Moolah wasn't going to let a student challenge her for the world's title. Now, to a degree, I can see that point. I wouldn't want my student to challenge me for the title either. Same time, at the very least, I'm not saying that Moolah had to give Sweet Georgia Brown the title, but she could have, at the very least, gave her a title shot. So while I can see Moolah's point of view, not wanting to give a student a shot, the bitch was ranked number 4 in the world. So I can see that point. Now, apparently, every time Georgia Brown came back from the road, she was pregnant. And Georgia's sister mistreated the kids because they were half white. Like, she would call them half-breeds and be disrespectful as shit. Like, this is the son telling this story. Because apparently they were, which was messed up, To me, that's disgusting. Not only is it racist and hurtful and a bunch of bullshit, but that's your sister's kids. Regardless of how you may feel about your sister constantly getting pregnant, at the end of the day, that's her kids. You're not supposed to hate them. You know why? Because it ain't their fault. It is not the kid's fault that Sweet Georgia Brown got pregnant a lot. Now, if you want to judge Sweet Georgia Brown for that, go ahead. That's debatable. But those kids don't deserve to be ridiculed like that. And for Georgia's sister to do that is not only ignorant, it's despicable. I could not imagine saying that about anybody's kids. That's disgusting. Now, Sweet Georgia Brown once said that she was once told to drink, pop pills, and have sex with men. Some of the promoters would pay some of the girls until they slept with other promoters, and she was their favorite. And according to Moolah's daughter, Buddy Lee was not a nice person. And one day, Moolah came home a day early from the road and caught Betty in bed with one of the girls that she trained. And she threw Buddy out, and that was it. And a lot of the girls went with him, and Sweet Georgia Brown was one of them. So apparently, that's, according to Moolah's daughter, Sweet Georgia Brown left with Buddy Lee after Moolah threw his ass out of the house for cheating on her. Now, the pastor later confronted Moolah to find out who his father was. Moolah claims it might be Buddy Lee. And he said Buddy Lee was apparently rough on the girls. He said if Buddy Lee is his father, then that's who he is. I wasn't coming in looking for anything, and I didn't want anything. I just wanted to close a chapter in my life. And he still wants his mom to be honored. And I'll be honest, up until this episode, I didn't know much about Sweet Georgia Brown. But if she was ranked number 4 in the world, and she was as good as the pastor says she was, then yeah, I'd like to see her be honored one day. I'd like to see her get the recognition she deserves for being a talented wrestler. Now, so Moolah builds her school into a powerhouse that dominated the industry, and it was in Columbia, South Carolina. There was a location, and it was actually called Moolah Drive, which had a compound that Moolah had for female wrestlers to live and train. She took girls from all walks of life, she molded them and shaped them and gave them a place to train and made sure they were taken care of. So they lived on the compound, they trained in the compound, and got booked and traveled out of the compound. And Moolah controlled the business. And if you were a woman and you wanted to get booked as a wrestler, you pretty much had to go through Moolah or you weren't going to work. Moolah had a stranglehold on women's wrestling, and she was not going to let go of it anytime soon. And then eventually, Wendy Richter and Princess Victoria show up in this docuseries. And they were trained by Moolah. Wendy believes she could beat Moolah, which is funny and ironic, and I'll tell you why in a moment. Victoria came from an abusive childhood. People begged her not to go to Moolah's, but it was the only way she could get booked. Princess Victoria desperately wanted to get into the business. Now, Moolah had a curfew at the compound, and if you weren't back by a certain time and you weren't working that night, you got locked out. And they had Diamond Dill, who was Moolah's roommate. Victoria used to bring beer on the property. In the apartments, they would have 2 or 3 women in there at a time. Now, around the ring were buckets for vomiting and blood. And it wasn't for in case you vomited, it was when you vomited, because it was going to fucking happen. And the rent to live on the compound was $300 a month. And she took 25% of what they got paid. Moolah had the girls do most of the heavy lifting with the training. Like, Moolah barely got in the ring and trained with anybody. She was having girls train other girls. Now, here's my stance on this. I believe that when it comes to this whole thing, this incident right here, either charge the girls rent or take a percentage of what they make. But don't do both. That's too much. I'm sorry. And 25% is fucking ridiculous. First of all, if you manage somebody or you're an agent for somebody in entertainment or sports or whatever, nobody takes more than 10. Know that. At most, a commission to somebody who is an actor or an agent is 10%. Anyone who tries to say they're going to take more than 10 is fucking scamming you. Know that. That's a red flag. No one takes more than 10. Now, I understand paying the girls rent to live on the compound. That makes perfect sense to me. Because obviously she has to fund things and keep it going. Because it's no different than if you're paying rent and living in an apartment somewhere else. But the 25%, I disagree with that. And also, I understand in some cases wanting the girls to go in there and other things and having like experienced trainers. But at some point, Moolah has to get in that ring to effectively show things. If you're going to be a teacher, teach. That's how I feel. Get in the ring and teach these girls. I don't care if you have to stretch them, but fucking teach. Don't just stand outside and watch. That's not fucking teaching. At some point, even if you stand outside and watch, if you see somebody fucking up, you got to get in the ring and show them why they're fucking up. That's what a trainer is. Your job is to know the people who are training with you don't know what the fuck they're doing. That's why you gotta teach. And Moolah sat there 24 hours a day making new connections with the promoters. And she would say, all you gotta do is sit your lazy butt in the car and go to wrestle and collect the money and send me 25%. She thought that was fair. Now, like I said, if you're gonna take 25%, at least drop the $300 a month. That's how I feel about it. But no, I didn't think that was fair. But I do agree that when it says all you got to do is sit your lazy butt in the car and drive to wrestle. As someone who's worked in indie wrestling, I know that to be true. I know wrestlers who get paid a lot of money to work a match. And they don't do a third of the work that other people do to make that show happen. That's why, you know, when people talk about like in WWE, some of the employees get paid more than the wrestlers. I'm all for that. Because even though the wrestlers do contribute a lot to the show, there's a lot of people behind the scenes that make that company happen, And even though in WWE, technically they are exclusive to that company, in the independents, you're not exclusive to a company. You work one show, you get paid, then you go home, and you can wrestle for like 5 or 10 other people before you come back to this one promotion. But the people who are in that promotion, who work there on a regular basis, who are setting shit up, they need to be making the most amount of money. Or need to be getting paid a decent amount of money because they bust their ass. So I do see her point, but still, the 25%, way too much. And eventually, Victoria left the property and quit the business. Now, the reason she left is because after she broke her neck, Moolah pimped her out to a promoter, and she snapped his wrist when he tried to touch her. Moolah snapped, took back the clothes she gave her, and kicked her off the property. Later told the girls she was arrested for dealing cocaine, which was a fucking lie. So obviously, Victoria had a bad experience with Moolah and, had that whole thing happen because they had to go make some money. So she was going to pimp her out. So, and then later on, they cut to Wendy Richter, and she talks about how she protects the business like protecting the country. Like, that's the passion she has. And WWF wanted younger wrestlers in the 80s, and they loved Wendy Richter. Her dad once said they couldn't put her face on a can of dog food to sell it. That was Fabulous Moolah. They said they couldn't put her face on a can of dog food to sell it. So they needed Wendy Richter. Wendy told Vince when she came over, she wanted to leave Moolah's compound and wanted her check sent to her so Moolah couldn't take 25% of her pay, which I thought was a smart move. And obviously Vince agreed to that because Vince wanted Wendy Richter. And like I said, the Rock and Wrestling Connection, I talked about that already. Captain Lou Albano, Cyndi Lauper, the song Girls Just Want to Have Fun. And Vince originally wanted Wendy Richter to be like the female Hulk Hogan. Like Hogan was the superhero for all the kids out there. He was the top guy, the training, the prayers, the vitamins, the Python's brother. She wanted Wendy Richter to be kind of that for the women. So Vince paid Moolah a lot of money to do the job for Wendy. She also got Vince's loyalty for life. Moolah knew to put her ego aside and do business for this belt. She had the title for 28 years, like I said. And the win took women's wrestling a whole nother level. And that was the brawl to end it all that I talked about earlier. Wendy Richter beat the Fabulous Moolah and became the women's champion. And that was a big fucking deal. Like I said, 28 years Moolah had the belt. When Wendy won, it took her to a whole nother level. She was over in this business. And then shit went down. Apparently, Wendy gets egotistical and didn't like the fact that the men were getting paid more. And apparently, Moolah damn near snapped Wendy's spine in the match. And Vince eventually had to take the belt off of her. And they had the Spider Lady beat Wendy for the belt, and it was revealed to be Moolah, and the referee does a fast count, and it was basically a screw job. And Wendy goes looking for Vince, but couldn't find him. So they basically screwed her over in the ring. They did a screw job, similar to what happened in Montreal, but a little bit different. And here's what I got to say about that. Like, people thought that the reason they screwed him over was because she was more popular than Hogan. Let me tell you something. I'm sure Wendy Richter was very much over. As talented as Wendy Richter was in the ring, she was not more popular than Hulk Hogan. And here's the thing. She didn't like the fact that men were getting paid more. Here's the thing. In the wrestling business, you are hard-pressed, and this is just the truth, to find women that get paid more money than the guys. The only women that are going to make more money than the guys are the women who are like veterans in the business, and you're a guy that's a rookie. That's the only way you're going to be a man making less money than a woman in wrestling, is if you're new to the business and you're breaking into it. But as far as like top guys in wrestling, I'm not saying it can't be done, but back then it sure as hell wasn't going to be done. Because even though women's wrestling is great and the women are athletic and the women are incredible in the ring, wrestling is still very much a male-dominated sport. People might not like that I'm saying that, but it's the truth. There are a lot of women who watch wrestling, but as much women watch wrestling, there are just as many more guys watching wrestling. And the guys, it's been a male-dominated sport for a long time. The women are starting to show that they can do a lot, but there are some things still that the men can do that the women can't. Like we've had women in cage matches. Some of them have been good, some of them have not been good. They've had Hell in a Cell matches. Some can pull it off, some can't. They've had the War Games matches. One was good, the other wasn't. They've had there's moments where the women have shown they can do the same thing as a guy can do, And there's times where women were given that opportunity and they dropped the ball. But there are women who can make a lot of money in the business and do very well. But back in the 80s, you weren't going to make more money than the guys, no matter how popular Wendy Richter was. And what pissed me off was the fact that Wendy had no reasons to complain, in my opinion. You just beat the fabulous Moolah. And you're worried about the men making more money than you? I'm sorry, were you making peanuts? First of all, Wendy Richter got paid very well. Vince was willing to give you what you wanted, which was get you out of Moolah's compound, got the check sent to you so you would not lose 25% of your pay, and you beat the most over woman in the company, and you're bitching because the men are making more money than you when the men have dominated the business way longer? That's fucking retarded. That's goddamn ridiculous to me. You literally had the world in the palm of your hand, and you flushed it down the toilet. Goddamn ridiculous. Now, apparently, if things had worked out with Wendy, there would have been a women's division with women featured in more important matches before it actually happened. So apparently they believe if things had worked out with Wendy Richter, the women's division we're seeing now would have happened back then. And they said Moolah held it back and then killed it because she couldn't walk away. Wendy left the building and never went back. She was done with the WWF. And that was pretty much the end of Wendy Richter's career, at least in the WWE. Eventually, like I said, she went back to the independent circuit for a while and then eventually left the business. And of course, she was inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame in 2010, Wendy Richter was. And she was inducted by, Roddy Piper. And then, of course, the fabulous Moolah, speaking of the Hall of Fame, she got inducted into the Hall of Fame in 1995. And the fabulous Moolah was the first woman to ever be inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame. And what's crazy was, that's the legacy Moolah had back then. Most people my age remember Moolah when she came back in the Attitude Era, teaming up with Mae Young, and they were doing the comedic roles and stuff. And how in 1999, she became the oldest champion in history. She won the women's title again at the age of 76, which was fucking amazing, And, she could still take bumps very well. And she was in the ring, well into her 80s, working matches in checkered schoolgirl outfits. So she was doing a lot of the comedic stuff, but it was fine because A, she was old, and B, she already showed back in the day that she could wrestle. So why not come back to the Attitude Era and do some funny moments? Because let's face it, with all due respect to Moolah, she was not going to take a spot away from the Attitude Era girls in 99. It was their time to shine. She was not going to take the spotlight away from any of them at that point. So there you go. She later died in 2007 at the age of 84. The wrestling family showed up in large numbers to pay their respects. She had a bench put in by her grave with a roof over it, so if you wanted to talk to her, you wouldn't get caught in the rain. And I like that Moolah requested that, and I thought that was pretty cool. It was a little bit of an emotional moment. Now, women's wrestling today has gone through a renaissance that wouldn't have been possible without the rise of women in MMA, and specifically Ronda Rousey. It's also more refined, and it wasn't that way in Moolah's day because that wasn't her strong point. She opened doors, but also closed them. She put wrestling on the map, but also held it back. Most believe that women's wrestling would have skyrocketed if Wendy was still the champ. She was the placeholder for 30 years. She wasn't a bigger star than Mildred Burke, and she's not as big as Ronda Rousey. And then, of course, there are some people that are, talking shit, but there was one part at the end that fascinated me the most. And that was Princess Victoria. Because after all the shit that Princess Victoria talked about the fabulous Moolah, the last thing you see in the episode is her condemning people for speaking out against her and saying they have no right to talk about things they didn't see. It's like, You literally just said she tried to pimp you out to somebody. You snapped the guy's wrist and she kicked you off the property and made you give back the clothes. Like, that was the weirdest fucking shit. Like, you literally just went from trashing Moolah to defending Moolah. That made no fucking sense. That doesn't make any fucking sense. Does anyone understand that? Does anyone comprehend that? Because I don't. I thought it was fucking stupid. And like I said, they talk about this stuff. And again, I don't know if it's true or not. At the end of the day, everybody has their opinions. There are people saying it didn't happen, and there are people saying it did. I don't know who's right, and I don't know who's wrong. I just know this. Fabulous Moolah's not around to defend herself. There's no evidence to convict anybody. You're just going off of rumors and speculation. And for the Fabulous Moolah, or anybody for that matter, to be condemned without evidence is fucking bullshit. I don't care what it is. I don't care who it is. And you could probably throw a lot of things out like, if it was someone you know, you wouldn't be talking like this. Yes, I would. Yes, I would. Okay? It's fucking bullshit to just have accusations with no evidence and have to remove it. Now, I'm not mad at WWE for pulling Fabulous Moolah's name off the Battle Royal, because they did it also because Snickers threatened to walk away. And that was their biggest sponsor. So when sponsors start pulling out, it's one thing to lose like tiny sponsors. But when your biggest sponsor, like Snickers has been sponsoring WrestleMania for like 6 years in a row. Like, this will be the 6th year in a row. Like, the WrestleMania that's happening in Tampa in April. That's going to be big. Snickers is a big sponsor because it's Snickers Presents WrestleMania. That means they're putting in the most amount of money. When you're the company that's presenting something, if you got your sponsorship on the marquee, that means you are pumping in big time fucking money. And WWE can't lose that money. Especially nowadays. With the way the pandemic is, they can't lose fucking money. We're still waiting to see if they're actually going to let fucking fans go in there. They haven't even sold the tickets yet. The time that I'm sitting here talking to you guys. But ultimately, you know, like I said, I think the Fabulous Moolah Battle Royal should happen. But if it's going to be that big a deal, you can change it to the Mae Young Battle Royal. Because like we said before, you know, Fabulous Moolah might have been an asshole. But at the end of the day, if you are a woman in the wrestling business, you owe everything to the Fabulous Moolah. Whether you were trained by her or not. The barriers she broke down. The things that she did positively in the business are the reason women are in it. Without the Fabulous Moolah, there is no women's wrestling. It doesn't exist. And if it did exist, it would be brand new and something we'd all be like, what? We'd be looking at something we'd never seen before. We'd be looking at something unheard of in today's culture if it wasn't for the Fabulous Moolah. This woman did everything for women's wrestling. And I believe is deserving of the respect that she has, the Hall of Fame, and everything else. And like I said, at the end of the day, I don't know who's telling the truth. But without evidence, I'm not condemning anybody. So, all right, and that, ladies and gentlemen, will conclude the Fabulous Moolah episode here. Like I said, this is a little bit of a controversial one. I'm sure I've pissed a few people off, but I wouldn't be the Booch if I didn't give my honest opinion. And when I give my honest opinion on something, I tend to piss people off. I speak from the heart and I talk real. And when you talk real, it pisses people off sometimes. So, see what happens. But anyway, make sure you guys tune in next week. We're going to have a great episode for you guys here on the Boochcast Reviews Darkside of the Ring. We're going to be going through part 1 of Chris Benoit. Now, I'll mention this again next week, but just to give a little disclaimer here, the Chris Benoit episode was divided into 2 parts. Part 1 talked about his wrestling career. Part 2 talked about the murder-suicide. Since part 1 only talks about the wrestling, next week's episode will only be about Chris Benoit, the wrestler. We're not going to get anything else. The murder-suicide's on part 2. We'll save that for then. So next week, we're just talking about wrestling, and that's it. So if you can handle hearing about Chris Benoit, the wrestler, tune in next week. If you can't, then I understand. Skip over that. Go to part 2. And we'll talk. You'll get the more honest more real stuff there. So I'll let you know that. So on that note, make sure you guys hit the subscribe button and ring that bell to be notified so you never miss another episode of Boochcast Reviews Darkside of the Ring, as well as other additional Boochcast YouTube content. Make sure you follow us on SoundCloud. Go to soundcloud.com/Boochcast, BOOCHCAST. Like us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram and Twitch. Support the show through Patreon. You guys know the spiel by now. All the links are in the description box, so you can check us out there. And of course, check back soon for a new episode. Until then, pizza, baby!